What's going on, my good people? Mike Hidalgo here. Thank you for joining us on another FCP Euro DIY. Today we're going to be working on a 2003 BMW E46 M3. Today on the M3 behind me, we're going to be covering how to replace your rear rotors as well as your brake pads and wear sensor. Included in the kit that we're working with today are Zimmermann rotors, Textar pads, our BOA wear sensor, as well as 4 set screws. Each rotor takes 2 in the rear. We have a couple other kits available on the website as well. Depending on your driving needs, you'll see a couple different set of performance pads as well as everyday driver pads. We typically recommend you replace these anywhere from 30 to 60,000 miles. It's all going to be based on your driving habits. A couple of things to look for with worn out brakes is brake fade, how aggressive they are at lights or stop signs, depending on when you're coming to a stop. Other thing to look for is just a visual inspection. You can see how much meat is left on the pads. There's feeler gauges available as well that you can use to measure how much is left on there. On the rotor side of things, the rears, while they can warp, you may not always feel it like you would on the front of the end of the vehicle. When you're doing a visual inspection, you can look for any ridges, any funny lips. Run your fingernail through the front and the back side if you can. And if they catch on either the inside or the outside of the rotor, then you're starting to form a lip, which means your rotors are probably due for replacement. Now we know what we're working with today. Let's take a look at some of the tools we're going to need for this DIY. And now for tools. For this job, it may look like a bit of overkill on the table. However, we have a couple duplicates, but mostly these are just going to be basic tools to do this brake job. Starting with a 3/8 drive ratchet. I have a 1/2 inch ratchet that I'm going to use as a breaker bar, a 1/4 inch ratchet for any hard to reach places and or any shields that we may have to remove underneath the M3. I have 2 different torque wrenches here. One is a 1/2 inch drive for our wheels. The other one is a 3/8 drive for all our hardware. You're going to need a 7mm hex, a 6mm hex, an 8mm socket. I have 2 different 16mm sockets here for both of my ratchets. A 17mm socket for our lug bolts. A flathead screwdriver is always handy as a pry tool. A hammer in case our rotors do not come off. And then a couple nice to haves, but not always a necessary tool, is a caliper hanger and or a bungee cord so you keep any strain off your brake hoses. You don't want to leave the weight of the caliper on those. This is a caliper piston tool from CTA. You can use a C-clamp instead. And then a little bit more onto not necessities, but just always nice to have when doing these type of jobs are some sort of wire brush or a wire wheel for a drill attachment. I always like to have the CTA syringe on hand in case I have to pull some fluid out of the brake reservoir. If you live in New England, you already know what this is. Some good old penetrating fluid and an impact gun to get our lug bolts off. Now we know what kind of tools we're going to be working with. Let's get started on this DIY. All right, my good people, we are at the rear of the E46. Today we're going to be working on the passenger side, specifically because this side has the brake pad wear sensor. The driver's side is not going to have that, so it just takes a couple more steps to get to that sensor, so we'll cover that. But again, otherwise the process is going to be identical on the driver's side. We're also working on the lift. This is a job that you can easily do on the garage floor, in the driveway. And to be quite honest, for me, this is one of the pinnacle jobs. If I'm thinking I'm working on the car today, I'm working outside, I'm doing an oil change, or I'm doing a brake job. But let me know in the comments below what you think is the typical go-to job in the garage or the driveway. Anyways, I digress. Let's get started on this. We're going to need a 17mm to get off our wheel. This car is equipped with studs, so we're going to be removing the lug nuts. However, typically you're going to have lug bolts. So impact gun, 17mm socket. Let's zap them off. All right, my good people, we have everything available to us now. We're going to start by removing the 2 set screws just so that we can break those free. And I like doing that first because that way the caliper still holds everything in place. And yes, this car has studs, but typically you don't have studs on these vehicles, so the rotor could just easily fall off. I suggest you thread in 1 lug bolt if you're doing this at home. We have our 6mm hex to get these set screws off. I'm using a short extension on a 3/8 ratchet just so I can clear the studs. And if it's spinning on you like it is on me, which it's more than likely going to, take a small flathead screwdriver or something similar, and you can jam it into one of the vanes on the rotor, and then let it rest up against the carrier, and it'll hold everything in place for you. With those 2 set screws off, now we can work on removing our anti-rattle clip. Usually you can pry from here, get them off. You can also pry them from the ears. Just be careful, sometimes they like to sling off, so you want to protect yourself from that. Now with that removed, we can transition to the back of the caliper, remove our dust caps from our guide pins, and remove our guide pin bolts. So let's do that. I like to use a small flathead screwdriver to pop the dust caps off. Sometimes they're a little stuck on there depending on the elements that they see. With those two off, we can grab our 7mm hex to remove our guide pins. Now on these chassis, and the E46 chassis, you typically butt up against the coilover or the rear shock or strut assembly depending on what your suspension setup is. So I recommend you break these free first before you get your ratchet stuck. And then if you can, try to get them off the rest of the way by hand. Again, this is just to avoid removing the shock body, or you can grab a standard hex key and do it by hand, or you can grab a small 7mm wrench that fits around this and just use that to pull them off. All right, at that point, we've kind of butted up against the shock body. I don't really have any room to get my ratchet in there. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take the route of the wrench. I'm gonna grab a 7mm wrench to fit around this, and then we'll use that to back out the rest of the guide pin. All right, I have my ratcheting wrench that I'm using. I got my end of the hex in my guide pin, and I'm just going to use this to back it up. At this point, we should have these out back enough where we can pull the caliper off. I'm just going to use the socket to try to pull them out. You can also get creative, grab some needle nose pliers to pull them out. The guide pin on this specific car, the top one, the rubber, is either collapsed or it's so worn out that it's physically holding the guide pin in place, so it's making it a little bit difficult to pull this out. Normally you should be able to just get them out, slide this right off. We're going to keep our brake pad in the inboard side on for now, and we're going to grab a caliper hook or a caliper carrier hook, hanger hook, call it whatever you like. I'm going to feed it around the rear spring coil and the caliper just so that we have no tension on our brake line while we work on everything else. With that situated, now our goal is to get to the two 16mm bolts that hold our pad carrier in place, so let's do that. With our caliper off, I actually went ahead and bungee corded it from the caliper over to the spring so that the hook wasn't in the way of our GoPro. So with that situated, we have all the tension off our brake line. Now we can remove the carrier. We have two 16mm bolts to remove. I recommend using a larger ratchet if you have one, or a breaker bar, as sometimes these can be tight. Now we can use our regular 3/8 drive ratchet to blast them off. An electric impact ratchet would work just well here too. However, you are limited to the space between the shock body and the location of the carrier bolts. There's two. And now with that off, we can go ahead and pull our disc rotor off. Just be mindful on older cars or cars that have been sitting, or honestly, it could just happen from lack of use. The handbrake pads inside the drum here sometimes like to stick to the inside of the rotor, or they develop a lip, and then they kind of catch as you pull these off. So you want to be mindful you don't rip out all the guts for the parking brake hardware. I'm going to try to give this a... No, let's be real. We're going to get the hammer out. We're going to give it a couple whacks from behind. For those of you at home following along without studs like this car has, I recommend you put in a lug bolt so that when this breaks free, it doesn't fall on you or on somebody else. There we go, that came off nicely. With that, we can go ahead and clean up this hub a little bit and prep it for our new rotor. Before reinstalling our new rotor, if you live in New England like we do, or you have an old car, these can get a little bit crusty. When you don't have wheel studs in place, you can just take a wire wheel on a drill attachment or impact attachment and kind of zap that. I'm going to use this small wire brush to clean this up a little bit, and then we'll put some liquid moly ceramic paste on there so that next time we do this job, or the next person does this job, the rotor is hopefully not seized onto the hub. Again, I'm using liquid moly ceramic paste. You can use something equivalent. I like the stuff because it's on a little brush. You pull the trigger and it just self-feeds. With that situated, we can grab our new rotor and set that in place. I just remind you that with zinc covered rotors, you want to try to either keep your hands semi-clean or avoid smudging them up too much. You don't really want to hit those with brake cleaner. It does deteriorate the zinc coating on them, so just be mindful of that when you handle your new rotors. All right, we have our new rotor. We're gonna position it so that our set screw holes line up with the rotor. And now we're gonna grab our same 6mm hex and get our new set screws started. If you want to, as insurance, you can add a little bit more ceramic paste to where they sit, just so that hopefully they don't seize into place against the surface of the rotor. And if you're following along at home, I'm just going to go ahead and snug these up with the old calibrated wrist. But if you wanted to torque them down, you want to torque them down to 12 foot-pounds. All right, nice and snug. Now from there, we can reinstall our caliper carrier. These are in fairly good shape, but as they age, they can get a little grimy. Sometimes they build up surface rust here. Just give them a quick wipe. This is what the pads ride on, so you don't want them to get hung up. And now we'll just take our two 16mm bolts and get those started by hand. We're going to grab our torque wrench and our 16mm socket and torque these carrier bolts down to 48 foot-pounds. There's one, and there's two. Now with those situated, we can prepare our caliper for the new pads. Now I like to keep the old pad in there, as I mentioned at the beginning, so we can use this piston retractor tool. And this end butts up against the old pad. If we did this with the new one, we'd be marring it up and indenting it. So the old pad is perfect for this. I'll show you what I mean by that. Again, you're going to want to center it as best as you can on the old pad so that the piston itself retracts evenly. With our piston compressed all the way in, now we can go ahead and remove our old pad. Load up our new one. I have it preloaded with some ceramic paste on the ears where it's going to ride on the carrier bracket. And I have done the same to the outboard pad as well. That's going to sit right there. Now we can go ahead and feed everything over. I like to take the anti-rattle clip and install that next, just to hold everything in place while I grab my guide pins. And now with that situated, we can feed our guide pins back in. I'm actually going to replace them on this vehicle. They are original and they have quite a layer of buildup. So as you saw in the beginning, I was struggling to get them out of it. You can see what a new one looks like versus an old one. Sometimes you can wire wheel these to kind of save them and reuse them. They're fairly inexpensive, but you know, if you need them in a pinch, you can clean them up. These ones were not cleaning up. I hit them with the wire wheel and they're just too pitted and corroded. So we're going to swap in some new ATE pins and button this baby up. With our rear pad loaded, I'm going to set it into the carrier. The inboard one will slide into the piston. To hold everything in place, I like to install the anti-rattle clip first. That will keep everything in place. Next, we're going to replace the guide pins. I like to lube them up before install to prevent them from getting stuck. Using a 7mm hex, I'm going to install the guide pins. And then we can torque those down to 22 foot-pounds. Now we can replace the wear sensor. All right, we lifted up the car a little bit more just so that we can work on this brake pad wear sensor. To give you an idea of where this was and why you didn't see me pulling it off earlier, it was zip tied up against the trailing arm up here. So we would have never caught it if we were just doing this, you know, in and out kind of thing. But to replace this, you're always going to want to obviously pull the end out of the pads, which we'll show you during install. Then you have a couple plastic clips up alongside the trailing arm that hold this in place along with your ABS sensor. And they just kind of clip, and then it's going to transition over to the back underside of the trailing arm. And same thing, you have another clip here. All right, use a small flathead screwdriver to free this one up. Some of these just break just because they're so brittle and due to age and all the elements they see. We have another one in here which wasn't even done. And that's as far as we get without removing any hardware. You're gonna see we have one 8mm bolt to undo up top here. Then we have a couple plastic rivets to remove underneath. So let's grab an 8mm and get that bolt off. All right, baby, we are a little bit more under the M3 now. We have one 8mm bolt to remove in our wheel well. So I'm gonna use a deep 8 on a 1/4" ratchet. We have our 8mm off. And now we have two small rivets to remove underneath. You can use pliers, you can use small little dikes. I'm going to use these to kind of get them started. Then we have just a kind of like a clip or little latch here that holds the other part of this plastic shield on to the side skirt. And now we have a better view of the junction box where our sensor's plugged into, as well as one more clip that holds the wiring in place. All right, back to that remaining clip. And at this point, I'm going to use this small flathead screwdriver to open up. You can see the top tab isn't even undone, or is undone already. Wasn't clipped in properly. And there's a second one that should open up. And then naturally the wear sensor, the one that's usually more replaced than the other, is the inboard sensor on this junction box. Go ahead and pop that out. And now we have a better view at our connector. If you can see this, there's a small tab up top. You're gonna wanna push that down to then disconnect our electrical connector. And there she is, in all her glory. You can see this one's been in there for a long time, routed incorrectly. Let's grab our new sensor and pop it in. We have our fresh new sensor. Let's go ahead and plug it back in the same way. These are also channeled internally, so they really only go on one way. If you can see that in the palm of my hand, there's 2 notches on the sensor. Most wear pad sensors are like these on BMWs. You're gonna wanna make sure those notches line up internally with the notches on the sensor side of things. Hear that satisfying click. And now the trick is to feed this back into the junction box and leave this elbow clipped inside the box while the rest of it is exposed, feeding the rest of our cable to us. With that situated in there, now we can start the journey of routing the cabling back to the caliper. You'll note on the wear sensor, there's notches for where these clips are gonna go. There are a couple indentations throughout the whole cable. Kind of gives you an idea of where they're supposed to go as well. Once you get to this last clip underneath the trailing arm, there's one more hiding behind it in between the fuel tank and the arm itself. That's going to be the start of it routing its way over the trailing arm to the caliper. Before we go ahead and install the rest of our sensor to our brake pad itself, we're going to reinstall our shield below. Again, that sits underneath this fuel tank shield. Sorry about the water coming out of here. We have a clean car in the shop today for once, and a little residual car wash soap coming down our wrist here. The main goal with this piece is to get it situated properly with the side skirt, and the rest kind of falls into place. I'm going to go ahead and start the 8mm bolt. With that 8mm in, now we can go ahead and install our 2 plastic rivets. There's one. And this outer one just joins these 2 panels together. And there's 2. With that all buttoned up, now we can lower down the car a little bit and reinstall the rest of our sensor all the way up to the pad. So let's do that. Continuing up above, we can feed our line up to this clip here. Press that down. We have one more, excuse my head, right here. Then we have one on top of the knuckle here, or the wheel carrier. And you're going to want to route the cable through the brake bleeder valve cover as well. And by that I mean simply popping up this cap if it's not already open, feeding the line through. There's a small notched area here and the rubber for that, and then just capping that over. And now all we have left is to feed the actual cable into the brake pad. So let me give you a close-up view of that. And boom, baby, there you have it. A properly routed brake pad sensor cable, no zip ties included. With that done, we can go ahead and reinstall our wheel, lower down the car, and torque it down to spec. Now, the one nice thing about this vehicle is it is equipped with studs, makes mounting it up a little bit easier. Same 17mm socket, same thing if you were using your stock hardware. Now we're gonna lower down the car and torque them down to 90 foot-pounds. Boom, baby, there you have it. Another DIY in the books. Overall, a pretty straightforward job on the E46 M3. The only thing changing on the rear is your wear sensor being located on the rear right, nothing on the driver's side rear. If you like this video, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you have any questions or comments on what we did today, leave them in the comment box below. And if you like this DIY and you want to see more like them, please consider subscribing. We make new ones all the time. As always, thank you for watching. We'll catch you in the next one.